Hello again, everyone. So this is going to be a real quickie. I was deliberating as I reread the articles on conscientious objection as to exactly how much information I wanted to give you to kind of aid your own note-taking, given that I want to give you some reading quizzes over this material and test how well you're picking up some of the important details from context. So this is going to be a little bit more superficial than some of the stuff I've done in the past, but I can't give you all the details or else, well, I won't really be testing you on the quiz as to your reading comprehension. So I mentioned in the lecture on integrity that the two readings for this week, which are these two, and the one for next week, kind of bleed into one another. They're all connected. They're all in various ways about access to emergency contraception. That's kind of the core real-world case that they use as their main illustration. These two are primarily focused on the concept of conscientious objection and how prescriptions for emergency contraception are a kind of paradigm case of where a lot of people think that filling those prescriptions violates their personal morality, but yet they have certain professional duties that seem to require them to fill the prescription. And Delston's take is different. Delston is using emergency contraception and contraception access a little bit more broadly as an illustration of how bias, and in particular, as you can gather from the title, sexism, manifests in the healthcare profession. So they're all interconnected. Some of the same concepts pop up in all three of these articles. I thought that what might be most useful is to just give you a sort of snapshot of the main kind of considerations for and against conscientious objection that pop up in these different articles. So in the parentheses here, I've listed the last names of the authors where the argument or consideration in question is brought up. Two things I want to note about this in general. One is the fact that there are more considerations listed against conscientious objection than there are in favor does not mean that it's an automatic win for this position. This is not a numbers game. This is not just a matter of adding up how many arguments can you make in favor of one position over another, because weak arguments don't carry any weight. So the fact, if we were to evaluate these arguments and conclude that none of these arguments were very strong, and we look at these and say, I don't know, these two we think wind up being pretty powerful, then we might come to the conclusion that conscientious objection is really important, and we should have, we should give pharmacists pretty wide latitude in being able to conscientiously object to things. So just note that it's not a numbers game. The point here, rather, is to just kind of catalog the different arguments that come up in the readings. One of the first ones that you'd encounter in favor of conscientious objection is a general deference to pharmacists' expertise. So we typically allow people with the level of education and training, like pharmacists and physicians more broadly, to exercise their own discretion in what they do. And conscientious objection is kind of an extension of that, right? We're giving them such broad discretion that we're allowing them to decline to do certain things that they would normally be required to do. Susanna Deans also considers the argument that pharmacists should be allowed to avoid moral anguish when it's possible for them to do so. I won't go into what Deans says about this argument, because you actually have a quiz question about that. But the sort of underlying idea is that no one wants to be put in a situation where they have to make a morally difficult situation. And so just as ordinary people often want to be shielded from those kinds of decisions, perhaps the thought goes we should allow professionals in certain contexts to be similarly shielded from those situations. Third one, which comes up in both Susanna Dean's article and Julie Cantor and Ken Baum's article, allowing for conscientious objection is critical to maintaining personal integrity. Pharmacists should not have to compromise their personal moral beliefs to do their job. I kind of alluded in my discussion of integrity last time to why this is an important consideration. If you don't have this built into your profession in some way, what's essentially going to happen is you're going to screen out people who have certain moral values from entering your profession in the first place, because they're going to say, well, I can't be a pharmacist or a lawyer or a doctor or whatever it is without being put in a situation where I couldn't abide by my own moral code. That's unacceptable to me, so I'm not going to pursue that profession anymore. If everybody reasons that way, though, then pretty quickly you're going to wind up with a profession where every single person in that profession just has a sort of homogenous set of moral values, and it's gonna create some potential conflicts with people, you know, who may be patients or who may be other professional actors that have different moral values. So, you know, medicine in particular is becoming more cooperative, not only among physicians and patients, but also among physicians and pharmacists and surgeons and other people in the medical community. So having that kind of insular, you know, view where you don't have diversity of thought and opinion, not generally viewed as being a good thing. You want to have, and that kind of carries into this fourth reason, which is, you know, we live in a pluralistic democratic society, and so there's a sense in which we should try to accommodate diversity of moral opinion rather than stifling it, and rather than encouraging conformity and kind of suppressing certain points of view. So some of these considerations I think are stronger than others, but in general, the one that conscientious objection in broad terms has most often leaned on is number 3. This is by far the most common, and that was why I had that whole lecture on maintaining personal integrity and why integrity was important. Often the thought is that the moral value that underpins conscientious objection is an appeal to integrity and a desire for people to not have to compromise their most central values and convictions in order to do their job. Now, on the other side, there's a lot here. There are arguments against conscientious objection. Now, it's worth noting that when we say considerations against conscientious objection, you could endorse all of these reasons while also thinking that it can't be, we can't throw conscientious objection out completely, right? So it's completely possible to have an intermediary view. Like, it's not like this is an all or nothing game, right? Where, well, you can either have conscientious objection and conscientious objection clauses, or you just can't allow it. You can have intermediary positions. You can have a position where you allow conscientious objection in certain situations, but not in others, or where you put particular sort of additional responsibilities in place for physicians who exercise conscientious objection. All right, so this might be a bit of a clumsy edit, but I'm going to insert a little bit of commentary on this map that I dug up from NBC News. I haven't been on this page for over a year, and it's changed. The laws evidently on this stuff have been updated, and also NBC's changed their policy where now you can't access this page unless you disable your ad blocker, which is why we've got this giant plan your vote ad over here that I have not been able to figure out a way to get rid of. So whatever. If you are on the fence about voting and haven't registered, you've got about a week to do that. And good news for you is that in Ohio, anybody can request an absentee ballot for any reason. So all you got to do is fill out a form online, and it's not that difficult. I've already done it now twice this year. So if that's something that interests you, you know, bear in mind election season is bearing down on us. College students are notoriously bad at voting, so I would encourage you to be a little proactive, do a little research on the candidates if you don't have any, if you don't have like much knowledge about it, and get an absentee ballot or vote in person. It's just good to make that a habit when you're young, so that you become a participant in the political system. If you don't vote, you basically got no say in what's going on in the country, because it's kind of how democracy works. So don't be standing on the sidelines for your whole life with that sort of thing. All right, digression over. Here's what this is about. Basically, across the country, every single state on this map, even the ones that are not colored, they all have conscience clauses on the books somewhere. So you'll notice here's Ohio, our little home state, and they're not colored, but that doesn't mean that Ohio doesn't have laws pertaining to conscientious objection. It just means they do not have a specific clause that addresses this particular kind of situation. So some states have passed specific laws about whether or not you can conscientiously object to filling a prescription on the basis of your personal religious or moral beliefs. Among those states, it's a little bit less, if I remember right, than half the states in the country, although I do see a couple on here that were definitely not here when I looked at the map the first time around. So the blue states are states where you can't refuse to fill a patient's prescription on the basis of your personal moral or religious beliefs. So Washington, Nevada, California, Wisconsin, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. Can't do it. Not allowed. On the other end of the spectrum, the purple states, so we got Idaho, South Dakota, Arizona, Missouri, Arkansas, and Georgia. Those states, you not only can refuse to provide that medication for personal, moral, and religious reasons, but in addition, you don't have to do anything else. You are not required to refer your patients to anyone who will fill their prescription. If you want to leave them out on a limb, you're not legally punishable for doing that. Now, for your group discussion, this week I gave you a case that originated in Arizona, and the conflict was created by the fact that the pharmacist in question refused to provide medication and didn't refer the patient elsewhere. The interesting thing, if you look up that case, is that it was at a Walgreens is where it took place, and Walgreens actually had a policy, an internal policy, that you couldn't do that. So the state of Arizona didn't take any there was no legal action taken against the pharmacist on the basis of state law, but Walgreens did wind up firing the guy. So there was still some retribution in that case, but it wasn't a result of state law. It was a result of a particular Walgreens policy. The middle states, these kind of light, I don't know what color this is. It looks to me like a light green, but I'm sure there's a more, it's not quite cyan. I don't know. We'll just say light green. These states, which include Pennsylvania, New York, is that Rhode Island? Is that filled in, or is that Delaware? What? Why won't you tell me what it is? Internet, what are you doing? That's going to bother me all morning. I'm going to have to look that up. I think that's... Yeah, that's Rhode Island right there. So that's got to be Delaware, right? Oh, now it shows up. It is Delaware. Okay, fine. New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, North Carolina, Texas, Oregon, and Alabama, right? Yes, Alabama. Those states... Some of you may recognize I'm trying to test my geography. I used to have all 50 states in the United States, like just down pat, look at a map, name them all, no problem. But I'm getting old, and it's not as easy as it used to be. But anyway, those states in the light green, you are allowed to refuse to fill a prescription in those states, but if you do so, you have to refer the patient somewhere else where they can get the prescription filled. You are not allowed to just leave the patient hanging. And then that leaves the majority of the states not having any concrete law on the books. What this most likely means is that there haven't been any cases in these states where the local provisions, whatever's currently on the books, have been challenged or objected to, and so there hasn't been any need to change the laws. Admittedly, that's only speculation. It's not like I'm going to check the history of every law in all of these 25 plus states. But most of the time, the reason that laws get changed or amended or supplemented is because there are actual real life cases that draw people's attention to some kind of a loophole or shortcoming in the existing law. And my suspicion is that just in these states, it probably just hasn't happened for whatever reason. Now, what this tells you about the current view of conscientious objection when it comes to filling prescriptions is that there's really not a common convention in the United States on this. These are three very different policies, and they're practiced quite differently all across the United States. So it's, what you're required to do as a pharmacist is going to vary depending on where you live and where you practice. Okay, so with that map provided as context, here are a couple of the considerations that might underpin the rationale that some of those blue states are using. So a state like California or Washington, where you're not allowed as a pharmacist to refuse to fill a patient's prescription. One consideration is that participating in the profession of pharmacy is voluntary. This is a profession that people choose to enter into. By opting into the profession, you are taking a certain kind of professional oath of a sort that you will prioritize the patient's needs over your own. And that means that making decisions that adversely affect them just because they seem to conflict with your conscience is not something you're at liberty to do, or so the argument goes. This consideration can also be amplified by number 2 on this list, that your choices aren't being made in a vacuum. The things that you do as a pharmacist will significantly affect your patient's health, and your patient's health is supposed to be your top priority as a pharmacist. Another thing that we'll talk about more next week is that when you allow pharmacists to refuse to fill prescriptions, there are significant concerns about it leading to abuse or discrimination, even if unintended. This can manifest in a number of different ways, but the general idea is that if you are a pharmacist who has blatant or even just implicit biases against a particular group of people, and you're at liberty to refuse to fill some prescriptions, you may, whether intentionally or unintentionally, wind up disproportionately refusing to fill prescriptions for people of a particular group or a particular background. And if that practice becomes widespread, you're going to wind up with a widespread inequity in access to prescriptions and potentially other medical services. And when we look at the way that the way that disparities in healthcare manifest, we see a lot of that. Not necessarily because of a refusal to fill prescriptions, but we see a lot of actual real-world instances of those kinds of disparities developing, more or less along the same lines, like just instances where small inconsistencies in how certain policies are followed, when generalized across a really, really large group of people over a long period of time, creates systemic inequality that's then really, really hard to identify and uproot. Now, one of the main things that Susanna Deans talks about is the concept of professional integrity. This is not exactly as she puts the argument, more like my gloss on it, but the way she presents professional integrity, she often suggests that when you invoke conscientious objection, except in certain particular kinds of cases, you're often going against the agreed upon values and duties that the profession has adopted. And so she thinks that a lot of times using conscientious objection on the grounds of personal integrity is actually incompatible with maintaining your professional integrity. And she thinks that professional integrity is what matters more in the context of in the context of conscientious objection and whether or not it should be allowed. Another one that we haven't encountered this in either of this week's readings, but Delston brings up the fact that when you fill a prescription for a patient, even when it goes against your own values, indirectly you are elevating and respecting the patient's values, and that's one way in which we typically respect patients' autonomy. We recognize that the patients are adults, they're acting on a set of their own values and principles according to which it's permissible for them to have this prescription, and insofar as we're prioritizing their needs and their circumstances and situation, respecting their autonomy requires we fill the prescription. Or so the thought goes, again. And the last one, this one ties in naturally to number 3 up here. The people who tend to be most adversely affected by a refusal to fill a prescription are going to be people who live in poverty, live in rural communities, are members of some marginalized group in society, or, as is often the case, a combination of these. Now, this might not be super obvious to you, so I'll flesh this out just a little bit. We haven't gotten to Delston yet, but she'll cover this in much more depth. The reason why it disproportionately affects people who live in poverty is that if you are someone who is impoverished, you probably have only limited access to medical resources. So you might only have one, say, source that you can go to try to get a prescription filled. If you live in a rural community, this is even more so true. There are some small towns in the United States where there's one pharmacy within, a 50-mile radius of where you live. And if that's the case, and that pharmacy is not a source that you can go to get a prescription filled, you might just be screwed. You may not have the means of getting that prescription filled. A related point, it can be kind of derived from these, is if you are a member of a community where you don't have, you don't have reliable public transportation, you can't afford like a reliable car. If both of those conditions are met, it's also going to be hard for you to get around to a location where you might be able to get your prescription filled. Here in Columbus, Ohio, this is not something that we probably think about a whole lot because there are pharmacies and similar outlets everywhere. And so if you really need to get a prescription filled, you've got all kinds of choices. And I can think of about half a dozen places that I could go within 10 or 15 minutes of where I reside. But most people don't have that luxury. I mean, people who live in really, really urban communities do, but a lot of people in the United States don't. And so it's worth, stepping outside of our own circumstances a little bit and thinking about how things are different for them. So that's a broad overview of kind of some considerations in favor of conscientious objection clauses and some considerations against them. As I said, this is not an all or nothing game. You can have intermediary positions where you allow for limited or contingent rights to conscientious objection, or where you specify a very narrow range of circumstances, or where you add on additional responsibilities for physicians or pharmacists who decide to conscientiously object in various situations. When you get into your groups this week, think carefully about what the right balance is between all of these different competing moral considerations. So try to think, if we're going to modify that map of the United States and we were going to get every single state to have like the same policy about whether or not you can refuse to fill a patient's prescription, what would that policy look like? Would it be a sort of blanket can't refuse policy like in California? Would it be the opposite kind of policy, like, look, just let pharmacists exercise their own discretion, don't put any additional responsibilities on them, like what you see in states like Georgia or Arizona? Or would it be something in between, like what we had in states like Oregon, where you allow for conscientious objection, but there are some additional responsibilities that come with it? Think about it. Try to sort it out amongst yourselves as the week progresses. Look forward to reading through some of your responses. See you next time.